Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Steve Cooke from the University of Leicester, where I teach political philosophy. And obviously normally I'd be coming to you from fancy lecture theatre, but today you've got me in my back garden. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about my subject, political philosophy, and I'm going to introduce you to a topic that I think is really important about at the moment, and that's the topic of loneliness and isolation. Now, political philosophers grapple with questions of morality concerned with how we ought to live together in communities. We're interested in political justice, politics of the common good, and about institutional arrangements that might promote the common good or justice, and about the policies that go alongside that. And the philosopher Jerry Cohen, in his essay How to Do Political Philosophy, which I recommend to any students interested in studying political philosophy, identifies three key questions that political philosophers are most focused on. The first of those questions is, what are the correct principles of justice? So justice is a special area of morality. It's really pressing area of morality that we sometimes, or I like to think of as an enforceable area of morality. If I'm owed something as a matter of justice, then other people must give it to me. I have a right to it. And if they fail in their duties, then it may be right to coerce people to carry out those duties. That's the first question. The second question is, what should the state do? And that's a separate question, because the state might be interested in promoting certain policies that are not about what we're owed as a matter of justice. Justice might describe a bare minimum of what we're entitled to, but there are some things the state might want to do that go beyond that. And so we can ask if the sorts of things the state ought to do, either to do with justice or to do with going beyond justice. And then there's a third question, what sort of social states of affairs ought to be brought about? So some states of affairs are desirable, and they might be desirable, and they're the sorts of things we ought to bring about, but they might not be matters of justice, and they might not be something the state ought to do. Maybe the marketplace or something like that can bring them about. So those are the kinds of questions we're interested in, and the topic that I'm going to talk about today touches on all of those three questions. So, loneliness, isolation, right? If you might think, in a time like this, a national emergency, global emergency, a political philosopher is going to talk about political authority in times of emergency. I might want to talk about rationing or politics of the common good, the suspension of democracy, the sacrifice of the individual for the sake of the collective, cost-benefit analysis in policy making, things like that. When I look around me, I see that my friends, my family, and strangers in my community, what they're most interested in, what they're most frightened about is isolation, is loneliness, is a lack of human contact, about maintaining relationships with their family. And they're all doing things to combat that. They're reaching out, they're providing care packages, they're sending gifts, they're making excuses to ring people they never normally would. They're keeping in more contact with family than is usual. They're engaged in projects that are about bringing people together virtually. They're having parties online. So I'm going to talk about those things that seem so important to so many of us. Relationships. Excuse me. Now, relationships enable us to get valuable things. That's one reason we think they're important. They're instrumentally valuable. Sociologists often talk about social and relational capital. The things that our relationships enable us to get. If I can trust my friends to look after my child where I go to a job interview, that's really useful to me. Networks of people who might help us advance our interests. That's, part of how we pursue our life projects. We depend upon other people to follow our goals. And if we're thinking about public policy in those terms, we might try and take this into account, and we might want to try and ensure that everyone has sufficient opportunity to gain those kind of benefits. Or we might try and maximise people's opportunity to gain those kind of benefits. Relational capital. But there's a more important reason, I think, to think about relationships. And that's to do with our nature. as humans. We're social beings. We are innately social. We depend upon being able to form relations with other people in order to flourish and live really good lives. There's lots of evidence for this. If we don't get good, fulfilling social interaction, then we can be very badly harmed by it. And we know this partly because scientists have done some very ethically dubious experiments on social animals, other primates, to separate them from their kin, and seen what harm it does to them. But we also know it because we've observed what happens to isolated humans in quarantine or in childhood. And we know that if we are left lonely and deprived of social interaction, then we suffer mental harms, we can suffer from depression, and we suffer physically as well. So it deprives us, being deprived of company harms our well-being in the immediate moment. But it also undermines our ability to form relationships in the future. Think about children who are kept isolated in their developmental phases. They find it difficult to form relationships in the future when they become adults. So it's important, really important, for children to be able to socialise. Being able to cultivate, to maintain relationships is necessary for us to live good lives. And it's necessary not just as individual people, but also as citizens. Our opportunities, our choices, our goals depend upon our fellow citizens for their fulfillment and for us to be able to exercise our freedoms. Those relationships, they provide opportunities to trust, to love, to gain emotional support, to be cared for. And that's a fundamental condition of our human existence as well, to gain self-respect. They're part of what it means to be human, part of our most basic set of needs. So we're in a time of quarantine and lockdown. Some states implementing curfews, police and military on the streets to enforce isolation. In the UK, some people stuck in their homes for up to 12 weeks, people isolating from one another within their homes. These kind of issues really become very important. It's difficult, if this drags on, for us to live fulfilling lives. Now, ordinarily, we're thinking about politics. We might not think the state has much role in helping us develop and maintain our relationships. But if we need to enjoy good relationships to have a decent life, to flourish, then maybe the state should have a role. We can think about the conditions that need to be in place for us to cultivate love, friendship, family relationships. We're seeing those eroded at the moment. So think about a couple of recent news stories and how those have fed into public policy. In the UK, we had news stories about the Prime Minister desperate to keep parks open because they're important for our well-being. If we're kept isolated in homes, we start to get unwell. You saw the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jenny Harries, saying, in relation to those park closures, there's a real balance point here. What we don't want to find is that we grow mental health problems or we grow other physical problems because of such a strict imposition. And we saw the importance also very recently of maintaining family relationships, with discussions about how we should navigate Mother's Day, whether we should stay away from our parents or keep away from our mums for their sake during Mother's Day. So perhaps the state does have a role. Perhaps we can think about the kind of resources that we need, social and relational resources, and think about the way those are distributed within society. They're not held by everyone equally. So the state might have a role in ensuring that those are distributed in a just way. Right? It might play a role in enabling networks, voluntary associations, routes of communication. One role that the state typically is thought to have is that it ensures that we have the rights that we need to enjoy freedoms. And there are a number of relational freedoms. We think about the freedom of association, the right to form and participate in certain kinds of relationships. And if the state is to do this, then it should do it justly. It should do it fairly. If it's going to do that, it needs to think about how to ensure we have fair equality of opportunity for those kind of relational resources. So, and that means we need more than rights, because just having a right to a resource doesn't guarantee that we will have it to a sufficient degree to flourish. Some people face extra disadvantages and difficulties in securing their rights. So if we want to make sure that people are able, not just in abstract legal terms, but really able, meaningfully able to participate in networks, to meet people, to develop their social skills, then those things take labour and they take resources. So the state has a role in providing access to civil society, educational institutions, ensuring the dependent are cared for, the isolated are not excluded, and that there's an infrastructure in place to communicate, places for people to congregate, public space, childcare, sports clubs, summer camps, those kind of things. And if we look at this situation we're in now, maybe the state needs to be thinking very carefully about how to change the structure of those institutions to move away from potentially some of those physical, geographical ways of congregating, and to think about how we might do that virtually and make sure that everyone is able to access those resources given our changing times. So, if the ability to form and enjoy good relationships is necessary for human flourishing, then the state might have a duty not only to ensure that people have those opportunities, but also take steps to ensure that we develop the social skills necessary to obtain them. And if that's a matter of justice, then the state must take steps additionally to ensure that we're not left isolated and lonely in times of extended emergency. It might be okay for a short while, but if this situation continues for a long time, it's going to become more and more pressing. So the state ought to take that into account in its policy making. Think about the institutional infrastructure that we need in order to maintain our social interactions during this kind of period. Access to the internet, access to phones, postal services, those kind of things become extra important, and we need to make sure that people are not deprived of those kind of things if they are necessary for us to flourish. Now, I said that some people suffer particular disadvantage, and we have to pay particular heed to them, the most vulnerable in society, those with restricted opportunities. So at the moment, that's many of us are quarantined, but there are also people in care, people isolated and alone, prisoners. Those kind of people have restricted opportunities at the best of times, so we need to avoid chronically neglecting them. Now, it's almost certainly the case that the state cannot and probably shouldn't do everything to ensure that good relationships are possible above at least a certain minimum. The state can make things easier, or it can make them harder, but some requirements are going to fall upon individuals. I mean, we don't want the state interfering in every part of our relationships, right? We don't want the state minister for friendship turning up at our door and making sure we've got a big enough circle of friends, right? Or that we've phoned our mum. So some of these are better, not the sort of thing the state ought to do. And some of them are not the sort of thing the state can do. So we might have, if they are nevertheless necessary for justice for us to be able to flourish, then we might take on those duties as individuals. We might have ethical obligations to ensure that our fellows are not socially isolated. So reach out to your friends, check in on your neighbours, keep in touch with your loved ones. That's it from me. I think if you found the topic interesting, there are a few recommended readings that I would suggest to you from political philosophy, and I would start with two really good papers by Kimberly Brownlee. The first of those is called Ethical Dilemmas of Sociability, and the second, The Lonely Heartbreaks on the Right to be a Social Contributor. And that second paper has a really nice reply written by Laura Valentini, and that's called What's Wrong with Being Lonely? Justice, Beneficence and Meaningful Relationships. Now, Kim has also been interviewed on social deprivation for a really excellent podcast by Philosophy Bites, which is itself a really great source of short philosophy talks. So I recommend Googling that and having a look at that, having a listen to that talk. For the scientific background, I recommend Matthew Lieberman's book, Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect. It's very readable. And I also loved Jill Stauffer's book, Ethical Loneliness, The Injustice of Not Being Heard. So those are great starting points if you're interested in the topic. That's everything from me. Take care, everyone. Good luck.